Welcome to FMI's Built In. I'm Scott Winstead, FMI Consulting President. I'm really excited to share my conversation with Scott Kimpland with you. Scott is a partner at FMI and one of the most trusted advisors in the industry to labor-intensive contractors. For more than 3 decades, he's worked alongside specialty trade contractors, highway and paving contractors, and self-performing construction firms to help them improve operational performance and productivity. He's widely recognized as a thought leader on productivity and operational improvement. But what makes his perspective so valuable is that it is grounded in real-world application with firms that are competing in our market every single day. In this episode, we unpack what truly separates operationally elite contractors from the rest of the field. We talk about discipline on bid day, the power of consistent processes, the need to eliminate the character-building projects, the leadership courage required to say no to the wrong work. If you're serious about improving performance, protecting margin, and building a firm that consistently executes at a high level, this conversation is for you. Please enjoy my conversation with Scott Kimpland. Well, welcome, Scott. Thanks for being here. Excited to have you.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
Well, I'd love to maybe just start off with a little bit of background context. When a client calls or reaches out, what's typically going on if there is such a thing as a typical?
Yeah, it's usually one of 3 or 4 things. One of the things that I'm seeing pretty frequently right now is kind of a theme around a business that's really growing and scaling quickly. It could be an organization that's kind of gone from one central location, maybe they've got branch locations, or just going through a lot of growth. And they're starting to kind of see some variability in how their projects are managed as they bring on more and more project managers. They're seeing variability in how projects get managed. They're also starting to see variability in project outcomes. And around kind of this theme of growth, I think you can kind of think of this like a contractor thinks of building a building or a structure. But if you're going to build something large, you got to start with a good foundation. And, I kind of look at this as, really building some foundation before you start to really grow and scale the business. Otherwise, the cracks start to show up, and the larger the building becomes, or the larger the business becomes, the bigger the cracks become, and pretty soon you have a foundation failure and a problem in the business. In some cases, it's contractors that maybe are seeing some margin erosion on jobs, or they've had a couple of projects that have had significant labor overruns that are untypical. In many cases, it's, hey, we took on this job that's much larger than normal, and our performance on this job looked a lot different than what we've seen on our traditional work. So sometimes it's kind of some margin erosion, labor overruns that start to show up that creates some interest in talking about this. And then I would say probably 50% of the clients that I work with, they're average companies or they're good companies, but they see an opportunity to improve the performance of the business. And it might be based on kind of what they see their peers doing, but they kind of have a growth mindset regardless of where they're at. A week or 2 ago, I had a mechanical contractor reach out to me, pretty good company. They were doing well, but they just saw opportunities to improve performance, some self-inflicted things they were doing to themselves that they thought created some inefficiencies. And this company roughly was doing 80 million in revenue a year. If you look at a company like theirs doing 80 million revenue, they're probably spending close to 20 million a year in field labor cost. And, I think the president's company was savvy enough to understand that, hey, if we can impact that a little bit, 5%, there's potentially $1 million opportunity for us. And that $1 million opportunity could either be, bottom line impact, or in some cases, you might choose to use that as competitive advantage on bid day, right? So you might not want to put it all to the bottom line, but you might say it just gives us cost advantage during pursuits of jobs and allows us to be more competitive on pursuing work.
Scott, just to build on that, you work with a lot of the industry's leading firms. I'd love your perspective on what do you think separates the best from everyone else?
The first thing that comes to mind, Scott, is I guess I would call it a growth mindset. It's a company, it's a culture, it's leadership that never is really satisfied with the status quo. They kind of have a thirst for excellence. They might be performing really well, but they always just see opportunities to fine tune and improve the business and are just always looking for the next opportunity to fine tune. So it's kind of that old saying that, don't let good be the enemy of great. That, they're always, whether they're good, whether they're great, whether they're average, they're always seeing opportunities to improve the business and are constantly driven to kind of work on those things. One other thing I think that really separates the best from average or best from good is just discipline and consistency in everything they do. It's easy to be disciplined and consistent when things are going smooth and things are easy, but when things get busy, when you have challenges in the business, it's easy to get distracted. So one of the things I see that really differentiates or separates, the best of the best from the rest of their peers is around just discipline and consistency of being able to stick to the processes. And I think this last one, we see it a lot in the industry, but some contractors think that it's a sign of weakness to kind of get outside help or look for outside answers. But, if you look at the best performers, they're willing to admit they don't have all the answers. I always say if you look in sports, the best athletes always have the most coaches. If it's golf, they have swing coaches. They have, athletes have diet nutrition coaches, but the best athletes, the 300 plus batters, have more coaches than, the average. And they're willing to look for those things outside and be willing to admit that, hey, I don't have all the answers.
Where do you see the biggest gaps between the average and the elite?
From just an outcome standpoint, bottom line profitability. And, if you take, I'd probably say the top 15% of contractors in any trade, and you just look at bottom line profitability, generally it's about 2x the average for their peer group, right? And we see this in our peer groups that we manage. You always have those companies that are kind of out there at double digit bottom lines and oftentimes 2x what the average of the rest of the group is. So one of them is just kind of bottom line profitability. The other thing, Scott, that I look at and often see a big difference, it's very telling on the front end, but just taking a look at their balance sheet. When you look at a trade contractor's balance sheet and you see a boatload of cash, you see that they're very rarely into their line of credit. They're kind of able to finance the business. They've got significant net over billings and just have an incredibly solid balance sheet. That's kind of an elite performer, because that also tells me, if you're looking at it on the balance sheet, it wasn't a 1 year kind of flash in the pan, but they've had some long-term consistent, results and performance if it's showing up on the balance sheet.
To build on one of the examples you shared a little bit ago, just in terms of the phone call you got recently, when folks call or when you're talking to them and they say, we're pretty good, we're decent, but we're not quite where we want to be operationally, where should they start? Kind of what's the first move?
Yeah, I think the first move is really in just kind of talking them through and having them think about what's the desired outcome and what would this thing look like if you really fine-tuned it improvement, but kind of helping them think through a little bit of the vision of where are we at today and what would this thing look like if we made the operational fine-tuning and tweaks that we needed to. And a lot of times that's where the economics around how much do you spend on labor, those questions come up. Getting them to kind of understand and really buy into the idea that, yeah, some of that's controllable. Impacting that by 5% is probably very realistic and doable, but helping them just kind of create a vision of what success looks like, to me, is where you really want to start. And I also think, just having them wrap their head around the idea that, this is going to take some work and there's going to be an investment to it. And the investment might be an investment of time. They're going to have to spend time working on this stuff in addition to kind of their day-to-day responsibilities. And most of these contractors are, they're pretty busy people to begin with. They all have full-time plus jobs. But willingness to invest time, there's probably going to be some investment in money and some investment in effort to get this stuff done. So even though it's very doable, just helping them wrap their head around the idea that if we do want different results, we're going to have to change the way we do things. Understanding that change is difficult. There's going to be some bumps and bruises along the way, but helping them think through that's important. And I always say that, hey, you won't save your way to prosperity. You have to invest in this stuff, whether it's process, whether it's technology, whether it's leadership, to be able to get the results on the other side that you're looking for.
So Scott, what you just shared there reminds me of a phrase that I read a number of years ago that really resonated, which is you're perfectly designed to get your current results. You and I have talked about this before, and we'll sometimes see this scenario where it's like death by 1,000 processes, none of which are followed. If you go into an organization, you interview 10 project managers, there's 12 different ways to do pre-job planning or insert your process. But in your experience, what are the fundamental processes that really truly are the ones that move the needle?
Yeah, there's probably, depending on the contractor, there's probably 8 or 9 things, areas that we look pretty hard at. And it really starts on the front end with project selection. Right now, if you think about it, Scott, the limiting resource for our industry and for most labor intensive contractors is labor, right? That's the limited resource. And the last thing as a contractor that you really want right now would be a large, long-term bad project that ties up your limited resource labor for a long time. One, because a big project with a bad outcome, you don't want that, but also it's going to keep you from taking advantage of other opportunities along the way if all your labor is tied up on a big, poorly executed project. So we look real hard at kind of project selection. A lot of people, refer to that as go, no go criteria. But if you look at our most successful clients right now, one of the things I would tell you is one of the characteristics is the best of the best have somehow figured out how do you identify and eliminate those two big bad jobs a year that most every contractor has, right? And so the ability to identify early on, which ones we should not be really pursuing or spend a lot of time or effort on. Again, for a contractor saying no to an opportunity, you know how hard that is, right? They're all driven by, wanting to land another one and ring the bell when they, land a big job. But the ability to say no to a bad opportunity with a good customer or a bad opportunity with a bad customer as well is pretty important. So that's one of the processes we look at on the front end is just how do they go through that project selection process and what gets through the filter and what doesn't. The second area we would look hard at is once it does get through that gate, but just there's some fundamental things in the estimating process that we look at. One, there's some analyses that we do around looking at completed contract data, that sort of thing, that gives us some insights. But how accurate are they at knowing and estimating their direct cost to do work? And so there's some things we can look at there in terms of analyzing their business to get some idea of how good are they at estimating their direct cost to do work, or the production rates that they're using in their estimate. Are those grounded in reality? Are they, based on actual historical performance from other similar work they've done? Or are they some sort of black box factor that an estimator is pulling out of the air somewhere? So, direct cost estimating. The other big thing that we have found in that estimating process is just getting operational eyes and operational input into it, right? So, before an estimate goes out the door, making sure we get someone from the operations side of a house, maybe looking at it, testing it, validating the production rates used, validating the assumptions, just really an extra set of operational eyes looking at it to make sure that something's not going to get out the door that just doesn't make sense from a production standpoint. And so having estimate review processes and maybe levels of approval based on the size of the estimate or the risk of the job, is best processed. But we found companies that get operational involvement during estimating. I think this showed up in the project management survey report that we recently published, but there was some metrics around this to show that those companies actually perform better and different than those who estimate in a silo and then basically throw it over the wall to operations. And that's where operations picks it up. So estimating process is another big area. You mentioned pre-construction planning, but just how do we get the project out of the hands of the people that got it, i.e. estimating? How do we get that through pre-con? And how do we ultimately get it in the hands of the people that have to build it, the operational team? That would include the project management superintendent, field management folks, but usually huge opportunity there to improve the flow of information, developing a real good execution plan for the job that everybody's kind of got buy-in and aligned around. And maybe a subset of that one, Scott, for some of these contractors, depending on the trade, but is, I would include prefab processes, figuring out early on what work can we take out of the rain, the sleet, the snow, the mud, outside. How can we move some of that in a controlled environment in a prefab environment. I think that's another area that there's some process things around that to see if we're doing what we can. Labor productivity, tracking and budgeting, but the whole process of how they set up their labor budgets, how many buckets do they break it down into? How are they going to track the job, but getting buy-in and understanding from the team that's going to be reporting that, hey, this makes sense, it's logical, we're bought in. And then on top of that, how do we actually report and track labor productivity throughout the job? How does that feedback get into the hands of the field leaders? The guys that are controlling the work out there and controlling labor every day. Short interval planning, we often look at the processes around how do your foremen and field managers plan their work? How do they stay out ahead of their crews? How do they make sure that the information, materials, resources, things that they're going to need to be productive are there when they need them, as opposed to a lot of last minute fire drills, emergency last minute needs to the shop, the warehouse, those sorts of things.
You're going back to what you said about getting operations eyes on it and getting them into the process early. Steve Chandler, who was on the podcast not that long ago, leads our leadership and organizational development practice, has a philosophy that really kind of resonates with me and with a lot of us, just this idea that authorship creates ownership. Get operations fingerprints on it because they're more likely to basically down the line say, I influenced this estimate, this schedule. So
Yep.
therefore I own it. I have to do something about it versus, oh, that's just estimating, flip it over the wall and I got to go deal with all their bad assumptions. You've often talked about KPIs and metrics. Just based on your experience, I'd love for you to share a little bit about which ones really matter. When you look at the firms that outperform, what are the 4 or 5 things that they're tracking consistently?
I'll kind of break it down kind of at a high level first, but there's what I call macro level metrics. There's kind of micro level metrics, and then there's what I would call behavioral, compliance metrics. And so at a very high level, one of the things I'm a big fan of anytime we start one of these operational engagements is to start with what we call a completed contracts analysis. Really taking a big sample of completed work. Oftentimes it's 2 to 3 years worth of completed projects, kind of run that through the grinder, if you will, but come out of the backside understanding that over a large sample of completed projects, first of all, what does margin gain and erosion look like on that sample of projects? And peeling back the onion even a little bit further is taking each one of the direct cost items like labor and on average understanding over a big sample of completed work, how much do we run over or under our labor budget? How much do we run over or under our material budget? Are we kind of covering up labor overruns with some material cost savings, which might make your margin gain erosion look okay, but when you peel back the onion, you find out there's something bigger going on there. So I'm a big fan of having macro level metrics around your direct cost variances. And I like to start with kind of baselining historically where a company has been so that as we begin to kind of take this journey to operational excellence and working on these processes, we can look at projects that are being completed post baseline and say, hey, are we really closing the gap on these variances? And a classic example of that, I see this a lot with trade contractors, but you do that analysis and at a margin level, it looks like their bid day margin and actual final margins are pretty close. And you'd say, it looks like they're doing okay, right? They're bringing them in right about where they expected. But when you get down to the direct cost level, what you see is crazy stuff like on average, they're running over their labor budgets by 12 to 14%, but they're saving on material 15%. And so when you kind of combine those two things, it covers up or it masks a bigger problem. And what you begin to see there is if you're looking at a big enough sample of jobs, you can definitively say that they are underestimating their labor cost consistently and they are overestimating material cost consistency. And if you continue down that path and continue to do that, what that's going to do is it's strategically going to drive you to picking up larger and larger labor intensive jobs that you overrun. And on material intensive work, you are going to become less and less competitive. So a large material intensive project, because in effect you're overestimating material cost, it's going to cause you to be not very competitive on that. So if you continue down that path and try to offset material cost or labor cost overruns with material savings, it's going to take you down a path where you just pick up more and more larger labor intensive jobs that you continue to lose more and more on. So at a macro level, I'm a big fan of these direct cost variance metrics, and you can watch those over time and try to close the gap. At a micro level, I kind of look at that as kind of job cost, labor productivity, knowing on a weekly basis or in some contractors' world, even a daily basis now, are my widgets per man hour job to date ahead of or behind the plan or the budget? And it's interesting to me that we'll put millions of dollars of labor in the hands of a foreman to go spend on a large project, right? I mean, the average foreman in this industry is spending millions of dollars of labor every year, but we never provide any consistent or meaningful feedback to them of, hey, what's the balance in the checkbook? Are we winning? Are we losing? Where are we headed behind? And we just trust that, by when they get to the end of the project, they still have a few bucks left in the account to do it. And so we've got people out there making decisions on our labor every day that have no idea of where they're at and whether they're winning or losing. And I like to use the golf example. I'm a terrible golfer, by the way. If you go out to play golf and you get in the golf cart, and when you jump in the golf cart, you look down at the steering wheel, what's the first thing you see? Yeah, you got your scorecard. And if you look at that scorecard, it doesn't just say 72, right? What it does is it takes that 72 par round of golf and it breaks it down into what? 18 holes. And every hole, every time you complete one of those activities, which is different than the next, as you're driving from the first green to the second tee box, right? You're filling that in. You're looking at how did I perform on the first one? Am I two over? Am I one under? Am I par? And you're getting that feedback, right? Now, if you think about it, if you just jumped in the golf cart and said, hey, I'm going to go around and play my best round of golf, and hey, when I get down to the 18th hole, I'm just going to add all this stuff up and see where I land. And unfortunately, that's how a lot of contractors do it. And so they get down to 80, 90%. They're on the 18th green, and they're adding up all these numbers from the day, and they're like, oh heck, I shot 102 today. But you can't do anything about it. And so I really like to use that golf analogy that for a construction job with a lot of labor, you need to kind of have your golf scorecard, right? And instead of different holes, these are different activities that you're performing on that project in sequence. What are you going to do first? What are you going to do next? So that every time you play a hole or every time you complete an activity, your foreman, he knows I'm two over, I'm one up, I'm at par. And he knows, can I be aggressive on the next hole or, where am I at? It just amazes me how much we allow our foreman to spend on labor without providing any kind of meaningful score or feedback to them and just hope for the best at the end. And then, a lot of times that doesn't work out too well. So
That's a great analogy. And I actually have not heard that before, but it makes a ton of sense. Scott, you were talking about just the average foreman and what they spend in a given year on direct labor. I haven't looked at this stat in a while, but not that long ago, the size of the average company in the US was like $2 million.
yep.
If you take all public, all private companies, mom and pops and everything in between, and then you just think about one, the size of these projects and the decisions and we're entrusting to project managers, superintendents, foremen, on down the line. In most situations, they control a lot more than the size of an average company in this country. You have to have a business plan in those situations. You have to have a budget. You have to have commercial acumen. You have to be able to relate to people. You have to understand process and change management. So it's quite a comparison.
The last metric, so we talked about the macro level, which is really kind of, the variances on direct cost. We talked about the micro level, which to me is kind of the job cost. It's the golf scorecard. How am I doing day to day, week to week, hole to hole on this course? And then the third area is around compliance. And really, Scott, what that's all about is once you've identified and defined these key processes, We are big believers that you should measure your compliance to process. Am I doing the right things consistently? What percentage of the time am I doing the right things consistently? I'm a big fan of James Clear. He
Oh yeah.
puts some great leadership content out there, and it's always so practical and always so simple. And a lot of his stuff is kind of themed around this idea that if you just stack consistent small behaviors on top of each other, that it's just like compound interest. The
Yeah.
flywheel starts to turn, it starts to compound. And, if you get a little bit better every day and a little bit more consistent every day, that over time there's a compounding impact that creates kind of a hockey stick in terms of your performance.
Scott, at the risk of dating myself, I'll reference back to David Letterman's top 10 list, but you had a post on LinkedIn not that long ago that was something to the effect of the 10 fundamentals if you want to be a great contractor. It'd be great if you could just hit some of those highlights here. And then obviously folks can check you out on LinkedIn if they want to learn more about some of the detail and some of the context behind this top 10 list. But I thought it really resonated and really very impactful for our audience.
I titled this thing the 10 fundamentals if you want to be a great trade contractor, starting with, building and reinforcing a field first culture where the office works for the field. And if you think about it in our business, the only thing customers pay for trade contractors is installed units of work. That's how they bill every month. That's how they get paid. And so, that there's a lot to kind of unpack around that one, but contractors that understand that and understand that the only reason that people in the office really exist is to support the heck out of the field and make sure they're doing the things that put them in the best position in the field to install the most widgets per man hour. The other one, we did talk a little bit around project selection, number two, the ability to say no to a good customer with a bad opportunity. The two bad projects you choose to turn down will likely be your two most profitable projects of the year. And again, that's a discipline thing. Boy, that's a hard one, especially with a good client. Number three, know your cost on bid day and understand that your costs are not the same as your competitors' costs. It ultimately gets down to how effectively each one of those companies manages and controls labor, because that's the big variable in this business. We talk about number four, cost or cost, margin's margin. Don't confuse those on bid day. I see contractors do all kinds of convoluted things and juice their labor rates and jack around with production rates. But when you're in a good market like we've been for the last few years, you can kind of get away with some of that stuff. But at the end of the day, in a competitive market, you really need to make sure that the labor cost you're estimating are realistic labor cost. There's not extra juice put in them. Margin is margin, but sometimes people get confused and kind of commingle those things. Or the one that we talked a little bit about, hey, they realize, hey, we always run over labor. So, we're going to kind of juice our material costs a little bit to kind of offset that, right? But those are kind of the games that people play that in a really tough competitive market start to get you in trouble. Number five, I think we've hit this theme pretty hard, but if you want consistent results on your projects, you better have consistent processes, right? That's a fundamental. For these specialty trade contractors, number six, as labor goes, your projects go. As your projects go, your company goes. And fundamental for these trade contractors is meeting or beating your budget for labor hours and dollars should be the expectation on every project. That should be par on the golf course. Number seven is around talent. The best talent always wins. Invest heavily in acquiring, developing, and retaining superstars. There's no substitute for great talent. And you can have the best processes in the world, but if you've got average or poor talent, even with good process, I don't think you optimize. Don't be a commodity. This one's hard for trade contractors, but trying to get out of that commodity kind of world, if you don't have a compelling value proposition that differentiates you, the only thing a customer can buy you on is price. And that one's hard, but I'm starting to see some pretty good trade contractors and have value proposition around their prefab capabilities, around their ability to kind of help a customer get to market quicker. With a lot of these end users now, data centers, hospitals, any kind of butts in beds businesses. If you have a compelling proposition around schedule that can help a hospital get butts in beds 30 days earlier, or can get a building in a cold, wet climate closed in and dried in 30 days earlier, people will listen to that. And so finding a way to sell something other than your price, if you can only talk about your price or your reputation, you're probably going to continue to stay a commodity, right? This next one, I know I'll have some pushback on this, especially from the CFO and the controller types that listen to this. But I always say don't obsess over overhead. I've got clients that obsess over their overhead, and in a labor-intensive business, overhead's not the number that'll kill you. It's labor. It's that labor variability. And matter of fact, I'm actually a big fan of spending $1 on overhead if you can save $1 or $2 of field cost, right? And so that might be, BIM, VDC, prefab. Spending $1 to have somebody detail and draw something that allows the field to build it productively and save $1 or $2 of field labor, I'll spend that dollar every day. And I think there's a lot of companies that just kind of get so focused on overhead that they kind of miss the big opportunity, which is that labor number. And then the last one, Scott, number 10, that was kind of your question before this was metrics matter, right? What you measure and share at both the project and enterprise level, it creates focus and sends a strong message about what are the priorities of the business. But, metrics to me just really are part of messaging around what's important to the company and what's the old adage, the things that you measure, the things that get done, and the things that people pay attention to. So, metrics are important in all of this.
Scott, you mentioned something just a minute ago. I think it might have been number 9 about just over fixation on overhead versus direct cost. It's the phrase, major in the major, don't major in the minor. The major opportunity to move the needle is the 80% roughly of every dollar that's going to be direct cost, whether it's material, subs, labor, equipment.
Yep.
Or if you're a GCCM, 95% of all your costs are in that bucket. But so many firms tend to fixate on overhead, and I haven't in 25 years haven't seen too many contractors that had a truly bloated overhead structure. So Scott, as you kind of think back over your career to date, what's the most common self-inflicted operational wound you see firms make?
By far, and Scott, you'll be able to relate to this because the founder of our company used to pound this drum all the time. But it was companies that chase volume, revenue, top line. The old volume kills, profit thrills. And it's kind of interesting. I can walk in a company's office, and when you're standing in the lobby and you see the E&R cover page of the top 600 specialty contractors every year, and they've got the one from 3 years ago, and they were number 200 on the list, and then they were 150 on the list. But they get fixated on top line revenue. And listen, I'm a big believer that companies have to grow to stay relevant, to create opportunities, to stay exciting. I'm a big proponent of growth, but I think when people get fixated on growth for growth's sake, that's probably the most self-inflicted thing that I see, a recurring theme around that. And then I think the other one, which kind of aligns around that, is this one's kind of a common theme that I'm seeing a lot just because of the number of mega projects that are out there right now. I would say the average size construction project in the US in the last 5 years has had to change dramatically. And it's probably the same with my clients. Their average job size has gone up a lot. But one of the other big self-inflicted things that I see is they take a really big, bad project way too cheap. And it usually ends up when you kind of do the post-mortem and kind of, at the end say, hey, what happened here? It was a perfect storm. It was a bad project. It was a bad estimate. It was a bad customer that was difficult to work with. It maybe had a bad design, and then they just managed it terribly. That theme, especially in the companies that we kind of run into that are really underperforming, I would bet at least half of those companies, you start to get in there and kind of understand what happened. And there's kind of one of these situations going on where it was just, we caught a tiger by the tail. Hey, this was the largest project we'd ever done. We didn't have an A team to put on it. And so we kind of had a B team, but it's just a perfect storm of everything that could go wrong went wrong. So we see that a fair amount as well. And those things are character builders. Most companies kind of learn from those experiences, and it's part of the, most everybody goes through something like that as they're living through the life cycle of the company.
Scott, as you kind of reflect back, if you had to leave leaders with one operating principle that should guide their decision making from bid day to closeout going forward, what would that be?
Yeah, I think it goes back to one of the cultural comments or things we talked about early on in our conversation, Scott. But it's have a growth mindset and a culture of continuous improvement. Don't be satisfied with where you're at. It's kind of the old what got you here won't get you there. But I think our industry is changing so quickly. It's easy to feel like, hey, I'm on the top of the world today, right? We've had a couple great years of performance that, hey, we've reached the pinnacle and we figured this out. There's going to be a new challenge next year. And kind of what worked well up to this point, there's just too much change. And I think contractors that just have that growth mindset, they realize that never be satisfied with where we're at, realize that we've got to continually be growing and learning. Our competition is going to catch up, the market's going to catch up. But to me, that's probably the big one. It's around growth mindset and just culture of continuous improvement.
Well, that's great, Scott. Well, this is probably a good place to end, but always a pleasure to talk with you. Always learn so much every time we get together, just hearing you reflect back on all the things you've seen and experienced over your years in this industry. So, again, thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I appreciate the invitation. I've been doing this a long time. Hopefully, my passion for this topic comes across. I love doing this, and it has huge impact on the industry. It has a huge impact on clients. And so, thanks for inviting me and enjoyed the conversation today. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks for listening. And please remember to like or subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss an episode.